Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to span the range of the 20th through the 34th verses of the 4th chapter of Kings. And Solomon is the human protagonist of the first 11 chapters of Kings. He is the son and successor of David, also the son of Bathsheba, which was David's moment of weakness where he was seduced by watching another man's wife bathe, and then he summoned her to his palace, seduced him, and then got her pregnant. And because her husband Uriah was such a valiant man of war, he refused to sleep with her while he was there, while his men are fighting out in the field. So David conspires through Joab, his main general, to put him in the line of fire, which he will not survive. And their first child dies when the prophet Nathan pronounces his judgment against them. He tells them there's going to be havoc in your home. So not only is the child born of him and Bathsheba, who he marries almost immediately after Uriah dies, going to die, but their second one does. That's Solomon. But also Absalom leads his rebellion after slaying Amnon, who raped his half-sister and Absalom's full sister. So there was devastation brought through it. But through it all, it would be an act of grace, because through that illicit, adulterous liaison, Solomon, under whom Israel would witness his greatest golden age, would rule. And in the first two chapters of this book, we witness the power struggle. He was not the only son of David, but he was David's designated successor, and he had to maneuver and triumph over factions and conspiracies aligned against him. But by the third chapter, we read he's firmly in place, and he is visited by Elohim in a vision whilst offering sacrifices at Gibeon, which prior to the temple in Jerusalem would have been the religious capital of Israel. And he's given a blank slate. Anything he asks for, he asks for wisdom. He's aware of the fact that he's a 19-year-old lad, and he is given the task of ruling not only any people, but the people of the covenant of the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. So he asked for wisdom, and because he didn't ask for riches or the death of his enemies, Yahweh gives him both. He also gives him a conditional promise that if he walks in the ways of his father David, he will have a long life. And by the 11th chapter, we read by the age of 59, he expired. But for the majority of his life, he did walk in the path, the covenant path. And in the second half of the third chapter, we read of an application and an experiment of this wisdom when two prostitutes bring the same child before them, each claiming that the child is theirs. And the truth is that one of the prostitutes had lost her son, so she wanted to take the other ones. And so how does Solomon settle it? He asks for a sword and is going to chop the baby in half and give them into both. And the mother, whose child it wasn't, says, fine, go right ahead. And the mother, whose child it actually is, says she would rather have it survive under her tutelage than to be brought, thereby proving her identity as the real mother. And in the first half of the fourth chapter, we read of the administrative organization of the kingdom. And we're going to pick up from the 20th verse, which reads, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea, eating and drinking and rejoicing. Therein we witness the fulfillment of an Abrahamic promise. He promised him and Isaac that his descendants would be as numerous as the sands on the sea, as well as the stars in the sky. Judah would have been the tribe from whence Solomon came, and it would have been the site, the capital city would have been located in its territory. But Israel and Judah were united kingdoms until, through Solomon's own idolatry, the kingdom would be split, not in his lifetime, but that of his son Rehoboam. And Solomon was ruling over all kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. They did task force and serve Solomon in all the days of his life. So he had a wide-reaching territorial jurisdiction which extended beyond the territorial limits of the Promised Land, but extended all the way to the land of the Philistines in Egypt to the south and as far east as the river Euphrates. So his jurisdiction and hegemony extended, in fact, beyond his the place where his rule was absolute. He extracted tributes from these people, and they were at his mercy and not the other way around. And Solomon's food supply for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal. Solomon was not only feeding himself, he had accumulated a vast court of many, many people who had appetites to be fulfilled on a daily basis. And David, he was a shepherd who became a king, so he had somewhat of a court life, but not much. But Solomon, being a prince born to be a king, he would have had a more active, robust, and vital court life than his father. 10 fatted calves and 20 cattle from the pastures, and 100 sheep, besides deer and gazelles, and roebucks, and fatted fowl. These are the dietary items that would have been eaten in that court. Just meat, to summarize it all. For he was ruling over all on the side of the river from Ziphna even into Azza, and over all the sovereignties of this side of the river, and he had peace on all sides round about him. So even though he had all the territories this side of the Euphrates to the west of the Euphrates, which was the eastern border of where his jurisdiction lived, so this was a witness of the Abrahamic promise. Now to this day, the land promised to Abraham has yet to be occupied in its totality by any of his children, but Solomon did exercise hegemony, if not sovereignty, over all these places, and there was peace. His name, Solomon, is derived from the Hebrew word for shalom, which translates as peace. So he was living up to his name. There was peace all around him. There was no commotion. There was no war. There was only trade and diplomacy. And this peace is good for commerce, because that's how he established his hegemonic claim. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and at his fig tree, from Dan as far as Beersheba, all the sides of Solomon. So I think some modern politicians promise a car in every garage and a chicken in every pot, but Solomon actually delivered that every citizen, or nearly every citizen, everyone of Judah and Israel, they had their own vine, they had their own property, they had their own fig tree, they all had their own property, and this is from Dan, which would have been the northernmost extremity of the Promised Land, and Beersheba, which would have laid at the opposite southern extremity. And this flourished and existed all throughout all the days that Solomon ruled. So his was a golden age of prosperity. And Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots, and 12,000 horsemen. Now in Deuteronomy 17, Yahweh, through the voice of Moses, warns against this development in kings, and Saul and David did not succumb to it, but Solomon eventually did. He acquired massive amounts of horses from himself, from Egypt, and so they were commanded to look away from Egypt, from whence they were in bondage. And so he had a lot of horses and chariots for his army, even though he was at peace. It was a peace by strength. He had the military muscle to enforce the peace. And there were 40,000 horses and 12,000 horsemen at his disposal and at his deploy. And these governors, each one in his month, provided food for King Solomon and for all who came to the tables of King Solomon. There was no lack in their supply. So all the food they wanted, all the food they could possibly eat, all the food they needed was seriously not a problem at all. He had a system. Governors who rotated in monthly cycle would give food for Solomon and his court, and there was no lack in their supply. Every agricultural output was healthy and flourishing at this glorious moment in time. They also brought barley and straw to the appointed place, for the horses and steeds, each one according to his justice. So this is once more a division of labor within an administrative system of gathering and distributing barley and straw. These would have been to designated locations where the horses and the cavalry could transport them to their intended destination. Now, we've earlier read of the riches and some of the administrative officials are named in the first 19 verses, but now we just read some of the material or carnal goods which flowed through this kingdom at its moment in time. Now we're going to hear of Solomon's wisdom, because remember, wisdom was what he asked for. He didn't ask for all this wealth, yet he was given it by grace because he didn't ask for it. So now we read of the wisdom. And Elohim gave Solomon exceeding great wisdom and understanding, and largeness of heart, like the sand of the shore. So in the 20th verse, we read that the people of Israel were as numerous as the sand on the sea. This is an Abrahamic promise, and the same thing could be said of Solomon's heart. There were countless and infinitude of thoughts which sprang from it. He had keen insight, and profound wisdom, and he all had a gigantic heart which enabled him and allowed him to ask the questions. He had a way of figuring things out, and asking the right questions is almost as essential as the ability to figure them out. So this is because it was given to him by the grace of Elohim, and the extent of his wisdom was exceedingly great. So it was greater than any who came before him and any who have come after him. He remains the standard of human wisdom, sans the Messiah, who was fully human but also had the added advantage of being fully divine. And Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the East, and of the wisdom of Egypt. Wisdom would have been a highly valuable commodity in the ancient Near Eastern civilizations. Egypt had a reputation for wisdom. Edom, from when the city of Uz, where Job hailed, had a famous wisdom reputation. Babylon had a famous wisdom reputation. The city of Tyre in Phoenicia had a famous reputation for wisdom. And the kings of these countries, their courts would be flooded with wise men in all places and all times. And so he was surrounded by a culture of wisdom-valuing people, but his wisdom exceeded them all. For he was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Haman, and Kylo, and Darda, the sons of Mahoah, and his name was in all the nations round about. Now we recognize Ethan and Heman as author of some of the Psalms, so these would have been men in David's employ who had he had inherited from them. They would have been organizers and arrangers of the temple music. But as we read, Solomon was quite the prolific musician writer, but he was wiser than all, so much so that his name and his reputation spread across all the nations round about, at least as far as 1,000 miles away. The Queen of Sheba hears of his reputation for profound wisdom and takes it upon herself to visit him, carrying great gifts for a distance of some 1,000 miles. Sheba would have been located at the southern extremity of the Arabian Peninsula, corresponding to the modern country of Yemen. And he spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. Now, I've heard that there, in the book of Proverbs, which Solomon composed and compiled, there are a total of 578 proverbs. That means we do not know all the proverbs that he conceived or invented. Not even barely a sixth of them we do know. So we have the number here, 3,000 proverbs, and he was also a musician who composed 1,005 songs. So he had musical ability, he had prose ability, he was the expert in the standard of Proverbs, and what 578 we do know reveals that there is never anyone quite like him in the composition of the literary device known as Proverbs. And he spoke of trees, from the cedar tree of Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. And he spoke of beasts, and of birds, and of creeping creatures, and of fish. So he had an interest in an understanding and knowledge of the created order. He was a biologist. He was a zoologist. He spoke of trees. The cedar trees would have been abounded in Lebanon, and through the good relations that had been established between his father and King Hiram, Hiram ended up supplying much of the cedar trees which were necessary for the great temple, whose construction we're going to read beginning in the chapter after this. And beasts, birds, and creeping creatures, and fish, these are all classes of animal species. He knew them all. He contributed something original, and his knowledge was profound by the standards of his days in zoology and biology. And there came from all peoples, from all the kings of the earth, who had heard of his wisdom, to hear the wisdom of Solomon. One of these we read of is the Queen of Sheba, who visits him in the 10th chapter of this book, and also in the 9th chapter of 2nd Chronicles. I did one on that. You can type in Corey Johnston, 2nd Chronicles 9, for that experience. But she was not the only one, because it is pluralized, all peoples. So, and all the kings, once more pluralized, of the earth. So there was no one within reasonable traveling distance who did not take it upon themselves to visit this man and learn and bask in his wisdom, because there was really no king quite like him then, and there really hasn't been one ever since. So wisdom is as appropriate and necessary for kings as it is for the rest of us. So I hope that's why you're here, and I'm glad to share my wisdom to enhance your wisdom, and any wisdom I claim none apart from the omniscient one, who is the source of all wisdom. But that being said, I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you soon. Take care till then. Bye-bye.